Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon for our talk. I think this is going to be interesting, but we'll see. So the topic of, this is actually a two-part series about American religion. What is happening with American religion? The first lecture is sort of about the problem. And the second lecture is offering tentatively some solutions to that problem. We're going to cover a lot of ground today. Hopefully you'll continue to be engaged, and there'll be some time at the end for Q&A. So I want to start with a quote from one of my favorite writers, Flannery O'Connor. She wrote this in the 1950s about the American South, about the fact that people certainly had some Christian identity, but they really weren't Christ-centered. She says they were Christ-haunted. She says, I think it is safe to say that while the South is hardly Christ-centered, it is most certainly Christ-haunted. The Southerner who isn't convinced of it is very much afraid that he may have been formed in the image and likeness of God. And then she said, ghosts cast strange shadows. So what we're going to talk about today is how Western culture has become more secularized. I'm going to begin by looking at some statistics about American religion over the past 50 years. And I would just say that if you are concerned about institutional Christianity, these are not going to be pretty statistics. So from 2008 until 2023, the number of adults who never attended weekly services doubled from 44 million to over 85 million people. These are people who never go into church. Church membership, and this includes mosques and synagogues, although I think those are probably negligible numbers. I think the vast majority of these are going to be Christian churches. You can see that membership in churches was fairly consistent through the 1940s, 50s, 60s, and 70s, and then they began to waver a little bit, and since 2000, they've really taken a nosedive. So we've gone from around 73% of Americans who claim that they're a member of a church to about 45%. And this is an interesting one. This is asking Americans, how much influence do you think that Christianity has in our culture? So about 23 years ago, 52% of people said, I think Christianity is losing influence. Last year, 80% said that. Now, this is a perception, but I think it's notable that this many people, 80% of people who were asked said, the church is really losing influence over our culture. Now we get into the specifics. This is going to be fun. The American Baptist Church. This is from 1987 to 2020. The Lutheran Church, the PCUSA, the Episcopal Church, the United Church of Christ, the United Methodist Church. Do you notice a trend here? These are not pretty statistics. Now, some people say, yeah, but that's because you guys are really liberal, but the conservative churches are doing great, right? That was the case for about 10 years. But then the Baptists caught up to us. You see, the Baptists this is the Southern Baptist Convention. This is the more conservative Southern arm of the Baptist Church. They were doing great. And when we started to decline, they kept rising. However, look at this. In the early aughts, they have begun declining themselves. And they're so big that even though the decline maybe is statistically smaller, the number of members is way more. So just in the last 19 years, they've lost over 3.5 million members. That's 3 times bigger than our whole denomination, the number of people they've lost. The top number here is the Methodist Church. They have also been absolutely decimated. They've lost almost 5 million members just in the last 19 years. Somebody might say, okay, what about the Catholics? Well, they're not doing too great either. Catholics, it's harder to gauge membership numbers because people tend to not really join a church. They're just Catholic. They're just kind of ethnically Catholic. But you can get a pretty good sense of church affiliation by attendance at Mass. Attendance at Mass has basically been cut in half over the last 50 years. And look at this, across all political affiliations, Republican, Democrat, and Independent. So I guess I'll just pause there for a minute and ask if anybody has any observations or thoughts, or are we all too depressed to go on?
Is that because of the split recently, or is that earlier?
That split has made it worse, but it was already happening. Yeah.
Are there any stats for those churches that call themselves evangelical?
So evangelical is a broad term that covers a lot of different denominations. So I bet a lot of Southern Baptists, if not the majority, would call themselves evangelical. There is a question about non-denominational churches. They're doing better. It's harder to track those because sometimes they are affiliated with denominations, sometimes they're not. It's a little harder to kind of categorize them. I would say overall they are doing better, but I think that's more a conversation for my next lecture, because we're going to kind of get into what's working and what's not. And so let me just, before I go into the next part of my talk, I want to say that there is a lot of hand-wringing over this, as you can imagine. I mean, we have church leaders in the room. People are very concerned about this. What I would say is that most of the conversation around this decline that I've heard is basically rearranging the chairs on the deck of the Titanic. People will say, well, we should add a music program. We should add a contemporary service. We should do better advertising. We should, have more Sunday school classes. I think that's rearranging the chairs on the deck of the Titanic. The real reason I think we're seeing this, I think it's not just church decline, it's secularization. So it's a much broader trend in it's actually a change in the worldview from a religious worldview to a secular worldview. That's really what I want to talk about today. That is not being discussed as much among churches. I think it's the thing that should be discussed. Martha.
Isn't there also a trend for just general deinstitutionalization?
100%. Yep. And we're going to talk about that towards the end of this talk. We'll talk about where are some of these people going, and it's very clearly the trend is away from institution. So what I'm going to be talking to you today about, I think, goes much deeper than sort of these superficial conversations around worship or music programs or whatever else. It's really, what do we believe about reality? And how have our views of reality changed? And we're going to be going back to the Middle Ages to look at what's changed in the West since the Middle Ages. And the way I like to sort of begin this conversation is that the worldviews that we hold are always invisible to us. And that's why it's been harder to talk about worldview. It's easier to talk about things that we can see and we can control. Worldview is like the story of the two fish. So one fish swims up to the other fish and says, "How's the water?" And the other fish says, "What's water?" Worldview is the thing that you inhabit, and it affects everything about your life, and it's invisible to you. That worldview has changed, and there's one philosopher who I think has done more than anybody else, certainly for me to help me understand the changing worldview in the West, is this philosopher Charles Taylor from Canada. He's absolutely brilliant, and he wrote a book in 2007 called A Secular Age, in which he attempts to do this exact thing. He attempts to say, how have we changed over the last 500 years, and we have become a more secular culture. So he begins with a single question. It's a very provocative question. He says, our question is how we moved from a condition in the year 1500 in which it was hard not to believe in God to our present situation just after 2000 where this has become quite easy for many. Does that make sense? It's a very provocative question. It seems simple, but what he's saying is that no matter what you believe now, if you were living in the year 1500, it is almost certain that you would have a deeply religious view of the world. And yet now it's actually, in some places, it's very hard to have a religious view of the world. So he starts in the medieval period of medieval Europe, in which basically the entire culture of Western Europe was guided by the Catholic Church. And one thing he talks about is the fact that we can't even really say that they had religion in Europe. The word religion didn't exist. Christianity was simply reality. To say that you have a religion implies that you have chosen one religion from among many. The word religion as a concept really didn't come into wide usage until after the secularization process had started. Does that make sense? So Christianity was as real as the chair you're sitting in. It was simply the way, it was just part of life. And part of what people say about the Middle Ages is that it was an enchanted age. Have you heard this? This means it was a world in which the spiritual dimension was real for people. It wasn't something abstract. It wasn't something that you questioned. It was real. C.S. Lewis says the medieval cosmos was tingling with anthropomorphic life, dancing, a festival, not a machine, which I think is a really beautiful way of putting it. Now, what Charles Taylor is really interested in is how did this affect people on a daily basis? And he says that people in the period of the medieval church had what he calls a porous self. And that means that not only did they believe that there was this spiritual world of angels and demons, but they believed that their self was porous. So that world of angels and demons could affect them, right? They were vulnerable to that world. They weren't cut off against it. There's a great story of Martin Luther when he was translating the New Testament in Wartburg Castle. He became convinced that there was a demon in the room, and he started throwing his inkwell across the room at this demon. Think about what your worldview would have to be when that was your immediate reality. That is a much different worldview than most of us have today. Now, the porous self has a couple of different dimensions. You could say, on the one hand, you could say, well, that's not good because I don't want to be possessed by a demon. That's true. But there's a positive side to having a porous self. You're also open to good things. You're open to positive spirits. You're open to God's presence. You're opening to guidance. You're open to protection. And that was really one of the big things, is that because you were vulnerable to a world that was potentially spiritually dangerous, you needed protection from a higher power. And Taylor says God was the only thing that guaranteed that in this awe-inspiring and frightening field of forces, good would triumph. And therefore, in general, going against God was not even an option. Think about that. Think about what the worldview would be like when it wasn't even really an option to not believe in God. So we're going to talk a little bit about how this is reflected in the medieval cosmos. So cosmos simply means the worldview, like in terms of the physical world, how people conceived of the world, the structure of reality, the earth, the planets, the stars. They got an idea from Aristotle that the universe was a sphere, and it was a picture of order, harmony, purpose, and meaning. It was a series of concentric circles with the earth at its center. What's important to note is that these circles were perfect. So there was a sense that that nature itself had a perfect symmetry. Their orbits around the earth were perfect. One way, let me read a quote. So C.S. Lewis talks about what this would actually have been like. He says that to look up at the towering medieval universe is much more like looking at a great building. The space of modern astronomy may arouse terror or bewilderment or a vague sense of reverie, but the spheres of the old cosmos present us with an object in which the mind can rest, overwhelming in its greatness, but satisfying in its harmony. So when you walk outside on a starry night, you feel like you're looking at this ordered universe that has a very intimate relationship with you as a porous self. One way, I know this is a very foreign concept to us, so one way to kind of start to understand how this must have felt like to a medieval person is to visit a cathedral. So this is Chartres, and I want to talk to you a little bit about how the dimensions of this cathedral were meant to reflect the dimensions of the cosmos. And remember, cathedrals were microcosms, so they were meant to represent in miniature this sort of ordered picture of the universe. So you have here what's called the sun spire, which is 365 feet tall, representing the days of the year. This is the moon spire, which is 28 feet shorter, which represents the lunar calendar. This rose window is a perfect sphere. It's 40 feet in diameter, representing the number 40 in Bible, which is a very important number. If you measure from here to the center of the rose window, and then you measure the same measurement from the front door to the center of the cathedral, you come to a labyrinth. The labyrinth was a metaphor for the journey of life. And while you were walking the labyrinth, you would look up at this rose window, which was representing both the divine light of God, but the sort of the scenes that are portrayed in that particular window are the scenes of the Last Judgment. So as you're experiencing metaphorically the life journey, you're also looking up both for help and also for anticipation for what would happen at the end of life. This was also 40 feet in diameter, and it was made up of 270 tiles, which represent the number of days in the human gestational period. So you're getting a sense of how this order, everywhere you looked, you saw intelligence, an intelligent divinity that had planned the cosmos, that had created you, that had placed you within it, that was continuing to offer you protection against evil elements. Now, I'm not trying to romanticize life in medieval Europe. I mean, it was a difficult time of poverty and sickness. But one problem I think we can say they didn't have was a lack of meaning, because they understood their cosmos to be so ordered. Now, what held all of this together? Of course, God. This is an image from an illuminated manuscript, a 12th century Bible that's currently in Austria, and it portrays God as an architect. And the compass he's holding is the exact same device that was used to draw the spheres of the circle of the labyrinth and the rose window. And I think that it's a beautiful example of how they thought this is the cosmos, and to God it's like he's holding this thing in his hand, right? This is the unity and the order in which we live. So now we have to ask, what happened? How did we move from this enchanted world to our world, which is disenchanted? That's a very complicated story. I'll highlight just a few things that probably contributed to it. The first thing, believe it or not, was the reformers. People like our spiritual ancestors, the Calvinists, all right, the Lutherans. They began to point out things that they saw in the Catholic Church that were superstitious, like relics. They said, well, relics don't really have power. Well, you can see how that begins to disenchant the nature of reality. There were other things. The Reformation was followed by an absolutely brutal war. In 30 years of war in some areas of Europe, a third of the population died in these wars. Then, of course, we had the Enlightenment, in which people began to question whether that cosmos was actually empirically accurate. We also had technological changes. The invention of the printing press meant that people could begin to study the Bible and theology on their own, which meant they could begin to question some of the things that they heard in church. It also meant that life was becoming a little more isolated, because you could study in the privacy of your own home. So all of these things and many more led to a gradual process of this cosmological picture becoming disenchanted. But what Taylor is more concerned with is what effect that had on the individual person. And what he says is that this disenchantment led from an experience of being a porous self that was in relationship to these spiritual realities to being a buffered self that is closed to those spiritual realities. Now, on one level, a buffered self is safer. But on the other hand, as I pointed out before, it also means you are not open to some of those spiritual powers that people really base their life on in the medieval period. So if we are becoming more of a buffered self, you have to ask, where are you going to get your power from now? If you can't get it from this field of forces that is all around you, where is your power going to come from? And what Taylor says is that more and more this sense of enchantment was relocated into the human mind. He says the process of disenchantment is the disappearance of the old world and the substitution of what we live today, a world in which the only locus of thoughts, feelings, and spiritual energy is the human mind. Can you appreciate how absolutely enormous that change is? Going from a world in which you're surrounded by very real power to a world in which you're protected against that, and the only place you can find meaning is within your own individual mind. This, of course, happened over hundreds of years. Most people didn't know it was happening because, again, it was like the water that you swim in. They really, it was sort of happening, but they weren't aware of it happening. One of the first people to really notice it and say, this is a really big deal, we need to pay attention to it, was Friedrich Nietzsche. Nietzsche, of course, was no Christian. He actually hated Christianity. But he noticed that people were living as if the Christian story was true when they knew it wasn't. So what he was trying to do is draw their attention to the fact that the world had changed and they didn't notice it. He says, "Where has God gone? I shall tell you, we have killed him. How were we able to drink up the seas? Who gave us the sponge to wipe away the entire horizon? What did we do when we unchained the earth from its sun?" I think that's such a beautiful way of talking about the fact that the sun, the Christian story that we had chained our lives to for over 1,000 years, we have unchained ourselves from that center of our meeting. Now, as often happens, the other people to begin noticing this change were the artists. So if you look at the artists who were making art in the time period of Nietzsche, we begin to see things like this. Clearly, this is a picture of a buffered self, trying to find meaning even though we've been unchained from the sun that used to pull us. And I think what Taylor might say is that these works of art literally could not have been made in the medieval period. It would never have occurred to people to imagine this kind of reality. So the challenge, I want to lead up to that. The challenge then is how do we make our way forward in a world that's disenchanted? Because people have to have hope, right? You can't live in despair. I mean, I think we're seeing some despair in these artworks, but you have to move on. And so, if meaning is going to be found in the mind, how do we now find hope? And what Taylor says is this is really the beginning of what we have today, which is what he calls a self-sufficient humanism. For the first time in history, a purely self-sufficient humanism came to be a widely available option. I mean by this a humanism accepting no final goals beyond human flourishing, nor any allegiance to anything else beyond this flourishing. And I think this is really critical to understand. Of no previous society was this true. There was no secular humanism, at least not on a society-wide level. I mean, you could point to a few people in ancient Rome and say, well, they seem like secular humanists. But as a society-wide belief system, he says it did not exist before this period. Any questions about what we've gone over?
Well,
Yeah.
I've always been porous self.
You've always been for self?
Porous.
Oh, a porous self. Okay.
And that allows the Spirit of God to move in these. And I think a lot of us are that way.
Okay. I mean, that might be something we could talk about in the next lecture. Are there people who have managed to maintain a sense of enchantment? I think you're probably right, but I think that the changes in our worldview might affect people in ways they don't appreciate. So, I mean, where am I here? Okay. Yeah, so I want to talk about this for a minute because I think this may not seem so weird to us because this basically is the civic religion of the modern Western world. So he's saying that the point in life is human flourishing. It's to make individual human beings happy and free. And of course, the language of the Declaration of Independence, I think, reflects this view of the goal of life, that we have these fundamental rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And that may seem so normal that people are saying, wait a minute, I thought that was exactly what we were supposed to be doing. What's wrong with that? I think what's wrong with that is if you're a Christian, human flourishing is actually not the goal. Think about what some of the things that Jesus says in the New Testament. He does not say go out into the world and optimize your potential. He says turn the other cheek. Walk the extra mile. He says greater love hath no man than to lay down his life for his friends. He says whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For whoever wants to save their life will lose it, but whoever loses their life for me will find it. And so now we're beginning to see at the theological level that we have two streams. And often they're mixed up and we don't know really, we think one is Christian, but basically we've got a secular humanist tradition going in one direction, and then we have a Christianity that maintains a theology that in some ways is diametrically opposed to that individualism. Taylor talks about this. He says one could end up rejecting Christianity because in calling for something more than human flourishing, Christianity was the enemy of the human good, and at the same time a denial of the dignity of the self-sufficient, buffered identity. Does that make sense? And as the years passed and we came to times like the 1960s, someone like Timothy Leary could say, actually, before that, I wanted to say that one of the effects of this was that the idea of liberation changed. So the idea of liberation used to be you wanted to be liberated from the power of evil, but the new version of liberation was being liberated from anything that would limit an individual's autonomy. And that leads us to Timothy Leary saying, everything we did in the 1960s was designed to weaken conformity to the old social order. Our precise target was the Judeo-Christian power monolith, which had imposed a guilty, inhibited antibody repression on Western civilization, and it worked. Millions of people writing their own Declaration of Independence, my life, my liberty, my pursuit of happiness. Can you see how we're moving from a porous self to a more and more atomized, protected, individualistic, buffered self? Now, I'm not trying to say that everything he's saying is wrong. I mean, I think there were some wonderful things that came out of the 1960s. I think in some ways people were trying to re-enchant the world through some of their activities. But the most important thing I think about this is this part. My life, my liberty, my pursuit of happiness. We're becoming more and more cut-off individuals. In academic circles, we have things like this. Postmodernism is incredulity toward meta-narratives. What he's basically saying is, we don't trust any story. Any story that would seek to tell you that it's true is simply false on its face. Well, what is Christianity if not a meta-narrative? It tries to tell you who you are, where you come from, what the point of life is, where you're going. It tries to explain in a story form your whole life. The postmodernists said, sorry, you have your truth, and if you try to impose your truth on me, that's a power move.
But his is a power move, because he's saying this.
Well, that's true. That's exactly true. I skipped over a prayer, which I'll mention just because I think it's a prayer from the medieval ages that shows us just how far removed we've come from when we talk about this, just how far removed we are from the medieval period. So St. Francis says, Lord, make me an instrument of your peace. Grant that I may not so much seek to be consoled as to console, to be understood as to understand, to be loved as to love. That's selflessness. We go from that to my life, my liberty, my pursuit of happiness, and there is no truth. Okay, any questions? So I actually have one more peg on the road to sort of complete meaninglessness, which is what happened in science, in some circles of science, not all, but some circles of science. We get things like Richard Dawkins, who says, the universe that we observe has precisely the properties that we should expect if there is at bottom no design, no purpose, no evil, no good, nothing but pitiless indifference. So think about the medieval cosmos with all of these layers of meaning and enchantment and orderliness and sort of involvement in the human person. And now we move to cold, dead, an accidental process of evolution that has no meaning unless we apply meaning from our own minds onto it. So this is what I'm saying is if the church doesn't understand that this has been the movement over the last 500 years, we're not going to be able to challenge people's worldviews if they hold a worldview like this. We also have to appreciate that these changes have made it quite hard to be a Christian. So Taylor says we have changed from a society where belief in God is unchallenged and indeed unproblematic to one in which it is understood to be one option among many others and frequently not the easiest to embrace. I think, don't we all understand that intuitively? I mean, it's hard to be a Christian. Right? You know other people, they have other religions, they seem like good people. You hear all these other stories, you have various versions of Christianity. It's one option among many others. Why would you choose Christianity, or even what version of Christianity would you choose? And we're getting now to what I really want to sort of talk about, and it's going to sort of transition us to the next part of our talk, which is it's really this plurality of options that Taylor is most interested in. He says that we're living in a spiritual supernova, a galloping pluralism on the spiritual plane. So if you can imagine a supernova which sort of shoots trillions of particles into the world, he's saying this is like the number of spiritual options that we have in the world today. So it's not just like, oh, it's a movement from believing in God to not believing in God. No. It's a movement from one worldview to infinite worldviews with no sin. I mean, there is no sinner. You can't even find the sinner. And I want to talk more about that before I head to those guys. So the nova effect, I think, is really important. And the interesting thing is that it actually affects atheists as much as it affects believers. This is really important to understand. Everybody's views are contestable. Everybody, even the atheists. And this came as quite a surprise to them. So if you remember about 40 years ago, you had these guys who really were evangelical about their atheism. And they wrote books and they went on speaking tours, and it seemed like they were ascendant. And they were changing the culture, and they were convincing people that you had to give up religion. Religion was a force for evil, and you needed to become basically a secular humanist. Richard Dawkins raised money for a bus campaign in England where he put this sign on buses: "There's probably no God, now stop worrying and enjoy your life." But what they thought would happen actually didn't happen. What we had, instead of the rise of atheists, is we had the rise of the nuns. So what this is, and I'm sure you've heard of this word nuns, is they do polling every year to ask people what religion do you affiliate with, and more people say, yeah, none. I just don't have any. They don't really commit to anything. And currently, this 29 has become 30. 30% of Americans identify as none. That is massive. That's over 100 million Americans. That's more than voted for either presidential candidate in the last election. But you can't presume to know what these people are like. The new atheists thought, oh, this is great. People are identifying with no religion. That means we have a lot of atheists that are following along with us. Then they started to actually ask these nuns, what are your specific beliefs? Turns out that 70% of the nuns believe in God. 67% of the nuns believe that people have souls. 63% of the nuns say there's something spiritual beyond the natural world, even if we can't see it. Then they got a little more detailed. Do you think that animals other than humans can have spirits? The nuns are more likely than the religious to say that animals have souls. Parts of nature like mountains and trees, can they have spirits? They're more likely than the religious. They ask them, can objects like stones and crystals have spiritual energy? They're more likely than the religious to say they can. And I think this is absolutely fascinating. And what I think happened is that the new atheists thought that everybody was going to become an enlightened humanist like Bertrand Russell. Instead, people are becoming like Russell Brand. And I mentioned Russell Brand. By the lack of laughter, I imagine people don't know who he is. Okay. I thought that was going to be a great laugh line. So Russell Brand is in some ways, he's kind of the... what's that?
I'm dating myself. I think I'm the only one that got Russell Brand.
Okay. Well, he does have a troubled history. But I mentioned him because I think he's sort of the perfect avatar of what I'm about to talk to you about, which is this sort of new era of you're not affiliated with religion, but you have all these beliefs about spirituality, and you're kind of finding them from a lot of different places. Because if you look at Russell Brand, first of all, he's got a massive following, almost 7 million YouTube subscribers, so I think it's fair to say that he represents some section of the population. He has been associated with 12-step recovery, Kundalini yoga, Wim Hof breathwork, psychedelic drugs, Jungian psychology, transcendental medication, numerology, veganism, Hinduism, Buddhism, and as you said, he is calling himself a Christian now. So, keeping this in mind, I want to talk to you about a book that came out a few years ago called Strange Rites, New Religions for a Godless World. Because this is, if you're interested in what are all these nuns doing, this is a great book. What this author, Tara Isabella Burton, what she calls these people who are not affiliated with religion but have all these spiritual beliefs, she calls them religiously remixed. because she says they create bespoke religions that remix elements of traditional beliefs with a variety of New Age ideas, political activism, internet culture, personal and sexual exploration. These are religions of one that favor intuition over institution. That was your question about this. We're going to talk about these guys now. They don't like institutions, they like intuition. Some of the examples of what she calls intuitive religions: wellness culture, techno-utopianism, witchcraft, new paganism, polyamory, kink, social justice, the alt-right, Burning Man, and Harry Potter. Now, one thing you might be thinking is, come on, witchcraft? Guess what? There are currently 1.5 million self-identified witches in America right now.
And they're white witches.
There are only 1 million Presbyterians in our denomination. So we are outnumbered by the new pagans in America.
You can be a white witch and still be
A white witch? Okay. Okay. So obviously these people are involved in all kinds of different things, and it might be hard to categorize them, but Burton spent time interviewing people from all of she spent years writing this book. She said she began to see a common thread through all of them, and she says you can actually kind of form a theology of all of these different new religions, and this is what the theology is. The tenets of intuitive religions. I am the only truth I know. My emotions tell me what to do and how to live. My most important goal is to become my true self. An unjust and repressive society has held me back from becoming my true self. It has warped my faith in my own abilities. There is no objective right or wrong. Different people in different societies have different moral obligations. Okay? Now, I realize I want to show you a video. I have to turn on the speaker. Give me 1 second here. So I want you to look at this list of tenets, and I'm going to play you a video of a workout community called Soul Cycle. Does anybody ever do Soul Cycle?
No, but I know people who, that's their religion.
Okay, so Jim knows people for whom Soul Cycle is their religion. Now it's a gym. You pay money, you do spinning classes, but I want you to look at this list of intuitive religious tenets and see if you can find anything that comes out in this ad.
This is not about a class. It's not about a bike. It's about you.
This is about you.
This is about you.
You. Your purpose.
Your goals.
Your drive. This is about you.
What are you looking for? What are you looking for?
What's your story?
What are you gonna come for?
What do you need? Be what you need to be, and it's all yours.
You don't have to be perfect.
It's not about how we look.
You know I'm still.
Everybody needs something different.
Everybody comes for a different reason.
You're gonna feel welcome.
What drives you? What motivates you? What inspires you?
What lights you up? Inspiration is on the
It's
inside.
about you coming and believing.
You finding your best self.
Whatever it takes.
Everybody gets something different out of this. Whatever you put in this is what you're gonna get out of it. It's about challenging yourself. And some people just wanna have fun.
Your goal.
Your goals, your dreams.
Your power.
So find it. Find it. Find it. Let it rip.
Find it. Find it here. You can become an athlete.
Push it further.
Seize it. Find it.
Let's go!
And once you find it, you take it to the next level.
Come on. I dare you.
Push it.
I got you.
Tap into your greatness.
Your power. Some people never know what they are capable of.
Be inspired by your passion.
Some ass. You're stronger than you think.
You're more powerful than you know.
I know you are.
Find your best self.
A higher expression of yourself. Your badass self. What are you waiting for? Figure it out.
I don't want to hear any excuses. Let it change you. Push.
Show up.
Right now.
Get it. It's yours. Find it.
Break through.
Find your breakthrough. Find your happy place.
A place that's your own.
Find your truth.
Find yourself. Find your soul.
Find your soul.
Find your soul.
Find it.
Find your soul.
Find your soul.
Find it.
What do you think? Do you think? Oh, Elena, go ahead.
It's like Descartes, instead of the mind, it's I am the body. I am, that's all about the body, yes?
Whoa, that's a rabbit hole. Getting into Cartesian dualism. I don't know if we, let's...
It's all about me, you know? If you
See, I would actually, because I would say you could say the opposite. You could say that the medieval worldview was a more embodied worldview that in which the mind and body were one, whereas this could be reflected more of an internalized self in the mind that's cut off from the body. I know that they're talking about working out, but I think that argument might be able to cut both ways. Bill, I mean, maybe other people have other ideas. Yeah, Bill.
Yeah, I'm sure there's so much to say. One thing just observationally looking at is that what we just saw is very religious.
That's my point. That's exactly right. Yeah. Yeah.
Is that the spiritual but not religious?
Yeah.
That's a nonsense.
Oh, I see what you mean.
Because if you know what religion, it comes from words like bigotry or
Right.
We're talking about what your highest values are, and everybody has a highest value. You say, I'm your highest value. That's your highest value.
Right. Right.
So all human beings are spiritual religious, and this is a perfect example of it. That is religion.
Yeah.
They're in a group. It's an institution.
Right.
They won't use the word. This would be more diagnostic. They don't use the word "we," but that's we. I'm not praising their theology.
Yeah.
But that's absolutely.
Well, there's a community element to it, and I think that's important. However, the community element would never be at the expense of the individual autonomy.
Yeah.
So you can have community, but if the community ever threatened what you personally, as yourself, wanted to do, they would never allow that. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's a big paradox in Christianity. You be unselfish and then you find your real self.
Exactly right. Yeah.
Actually, in a way, Christianity does.
Yeah.
But just think of here, though, it needs all the criteria of it. They're doing what they don't know in a way. That's not an individual act. They're pressing towards, they're pressing towards being a group.
Yeah.
Loving each other in some way. Our language today is it's all about ourselves above us. I'll get that. But all I just say is an observation. That was a religious act.
Yeah.
That's a religious
Yeah.
act.
Let me get Jim. Yep.
I hadn't made the thought still, but I found myself thinking, isn't it terrifying to think that the self knows what's best for the self? Yes.
Right. Right. Yeah. Right. Let me go through a few more examples, and then we can have some time for Q&A. She talks about some other things. She talks about how politics can become a religion for a lot of people on both the left and the right. She says that on the left, the social justice movement, with a utopian vision, these people believe that all of society is a script that must be rewritten. And then she talks about the atavistic right that supports Trump. While adherents in this group might espouse a belief in the Christian God, there is also a strong Darwinian leaning which appeals to a nostalgic masculine view of what the world should be. She then spends some really interesting chapters on techno-optimism or techno-utopianism. Is anybody familiar with this? This is apparently a really big deal in Silicon Valley right now. It's basically the idea that technology is going to allow us to transcend all human limitations. So these people literally envision a point in the future called the singularity when AI and humans will merge. And they think this is a good thing. So Ray Kurzweil, these are not French people. This guy's won like tons of awards. By 2030, our thinking will be a hybrid of biological and non-biological thinking. We're going to gradually merge and enhance ourselves. In my view, that's the nature of being human, to transcend our limitations. And you might think, oh, that sounds really fringe and far-fetched. Did you catch the Mark Zuckerberg interview last month where he said, people need more than 3 friends. We're going to give them AI friends. And this is going to replace human relationships for them, right? This is happening, right? And it's being monetized in a way that is so much more powerful than anything that we could affect. So I want to, yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah, go ahead.
On that, and I probably have something for next week, but if somebody's thinking like that, right? Like, it's almost like I can imagine a lot of people in this room going like, "Oh my God, that's crazy." That
Yeah.
Mark Zuckerberg thought that.
Yeah.
And it's like it's objectionable, and you can almost paint this like you could theorize that it could be even like intentionally wrong to think that way, but really it's like, well, but if we're also going to talk to Mark Zuckerberg because we want to share the message that Christianity has,
Yeah.
it's like, he's thinking that way. Probably not so that he is strictly accumulating power and evil and control over people, but maybe because he believes it would be a good thing.
Oh, I'm sure he, yeah. I'm sure he does, yeah. Yeah.
And it's sort of like there's like an ebb and flow, and we're in the one far end of the flow right now, where if you're talking from a science, if you're talking like logic and science, you end up, or you're talking religion to a logic and science person, you end up, casting whatever you're saying away.
Yeah.
We're not getting anywhere with that.
Yeah.
And instead of like fighting about like, no, I'm right, you're right.
Yeah.
It's like, how do you actually like talk to those people?
It's a great point. I mean, that's why you have to get to the level of worldview. You have to say, what do you think is true? What is reality to you? What is good to you? What is bad to you? Once you have to get, if you just, focus on these more superficial differences, you literally will, and that's what 99% of political discourse is just never addressing the underlying. So I'm not going to leave you on a scared, terrified note about our techno-utopian future. I want to tell you, and this is sort of a lead into the next lecture, which is actually the last Sunday of this month, so it's in three weeks, I think. There has begun to be a noticeable shift against this. And that's giving me a lot of hope. Part of it is that people have tried this worldview and that they've found, this is not the way I'm supposed to feel. This is not the world that I want to inhabit. And as I said before, we often see this, that artists say this before, they sort of notice it before other people do. So Julian Barnes is a novelist from England. He starts off this book by saying, I don't believe in God, but I miss him. The Postal Service, indie rock band. I want so badly to believe that there is truth, that love is real, and I want life in every word to the extent that it's absurd. It's a longing for an enchanted world. Who's watched the Barbie movie? Right? You know the music in the Barbie movie? Anybody like Billie Eilish? I used to float, now I just fall down. I used to know, but now I'm not sure what I was made for. What was I made for? So what I'm suggesting here is that maybe Flannery O'Connor was right. Maybe even though we think we've moved beyond a Christian view of the world, there's a hauntedness, that we're being haunted by this voice that's saying, maybe there's something real here that you've given up on. And believe it or not, even our friend Mr. Dawkins has recently been saying, gosh, maybe we shouldn't get rid of all the churches. This was just last year on an interview in England.
Well, I must say I was slightly horrified to hear that Ramadan is being promoted instead. I do think that we are culturally a Christian country. I call myself a cultural Christian. I'm not a believer. But there's a distinction between being a believing Christian and being a cultural Christian. And so, I love hymns and Christmas carols, and I sort of feel at home in the Christian ethos. I feel that we are a Christian country in that sense. It's true that statistically the number of people who actually believe in Christianity is going down, and I'm happy with that. But I would not be happy if, for example, we lost all our cathedrals and our beautiful parish churches. So I count myself a cultural Christian. I think it would matter if we substituted any alternative religion. That would be truly dreadful.
Somebody saw this interview and tweeted, seemingly intelligent man says he greatly enjoys eating, but is also glad that farms in his country are closing and that gardens are not being planted. So that's the last word. Thank you for listening. And we do have some time. Thank you. We do have some time for Q&A. Denise.
I wonder if there's a commonality with the tenets of the intuitive religions. The one, my most important goal is to become my true self.
Right.
As defined by God.
Sure.
You were talking today in a sermon about sort of the ephemeral area of time. Is there a commonality there?
Well, I think Bill said that Jesus says those who want to save their life must lose it. So if you give up any pretension that you can guide your own life and you surrender it to Christ. I'm sorry, I'm being a little more Christian here for anybody who's not from that background, but I'm trying to. So that would be the way, I think in a Christian sense anyway, Your true self would be yourself in Christ. It would not be yourself outside of that relationship. It wouldn't be something that you could just go find on your own by mixing and matching a bunch of random traditions. Allison.
I'm still just burning over the Soul Cycle ad, and I just want to, like, there's just, it's really related to what Bill said, because I do truly think that's a religious ad, because the thing that we didn't talk about is that it's such a manipulation in the way that it was presented. If you do this worship of self, all the people that were in black and white, then you can, it's so easy for us to manipulate you, because then all of the group shots are in color. So we're going to say, be all about you, but if you come and join us, then your life is in color. So
Well,
I'm irritated
yeah.
by the ad.
So one thing we didn't talk about is the wellness economy. So SoulCycle had $130 million in revenue last year. And if you look at the wellness economy globally, it's a $6 trillion industry. So it is a good point as you're welcoming people into this religious experience. What's your real motivation? Is it to help people or is it to monetize them?
I just want to say, there's so much intellectual stuff to do here. And I don't want to impose on anything. Trained as reports, right? It's not actually reports on it. It's just me. These issues, as we all know, are very much in the culture. If you go on YouTube or anything else, podcasts, you're going to see tons of debates about these kinds of issues. It's very live stuff. And they're interesting to look at those debates and argue about it. Very important. What I've noticed recently is that a lot of those debates, especially when they're good debates, real intellectual minds on both sides, they often get down to, that's this word, the people on, let's say, the non-Christian side, I don't want to praise Christians too much, will say, I don't know that love. Sometimes literally that phrase. These are people who don't know each other, they're using that phrase. Christians will start talking about the love of God. And then the atheist people say, I don't know that love.
Yeah.
I'll just report.
Yeah. So Tim Keller used to talk about that. Tim Keller is one of my favorite preachers, and his whole ministry was with skeptical people in New York City. And so he developed a really brilliant language to try to talk to those people. And he would say he knew he was getting somewhere if the person would say, gosh, I don't believe that, but it would be nice if that were true. Because he knew that at least then they were responding to what he was feeling. And maybe then at some point they could start to believe that maybe it could be true.